I was caught up in drug addiction for about 15, 20 years, and I think if I hadn't been found by God, I wouldn't be here now.
Matt Rothel arrived in St Albans 3 years ago. He'd recently become a Christian. Then homeless and waiting for a room in a local hostel, he felt drawn to the cathedral.
And I suppose I felt then, and I knew then, that this is the place that I kind of had to be. The church called it a calling, I suppose, and I mean, in more respects, it's more of a bellowing.
When did you next come here?
Pretty much every day thereafter. And I felt a lot of comfort from coming here on my own, talking to people, and it was kind of very reassuring for me to be here in that environment, given the environment that I'd been in before that.
When the priest had lived in his house some days...
Matt's now a regular worshipper at St Albans Cathedral, and this year he's taking part in the festival pilgrimage.
Matt, what was it like to be actually part of the procession?
It feels good to be a part of somebody else's story and to be able to help other people to understand that story. It's been a massive eye-opener for me, you know, the help and the support I've got from people. I certainly wouldn't imagine I'd have ever been the sort of person to go to cathedral. I suppose for me, I thought it was very much, yeah, you know, yeah, a bit stuffy. And it's not really, you know, it's a good place, good people. I know that like St Alban, I was lost until I found Christianity. I know most people that know me are still kind of still scratching their heads thinking, oh, you know, when's this kind of bit of the story going to end? And I sort of have to pinch myself, to be honest with you, to think where I was and where I am now. The fact that I'm thinking about going to university this year, you know, and I'm helping other people in recovery as well now, which is a big thing. So yeah, it's good. It's great, isn't it? Yeah.
King of kings, Majesty, God of heaven, living in me, gentle Savior, closest friend, strong deliverer, beginning and end. Oh, within me falls at your throne, your majesty, I can but bow. I lay my all before you now. Your Majesty, earth and heaven worship you, love eternal, faithful and true, who bore the nations, ransomed souls, brought this sinner near to your throne. Oh, within me cries out in
Well, so far we've heard about the Cornish St Neot, the Roman St Alban, and now here's a take on a fascinating legend about an Irish female saint that's given a small community in Cumbria its saintly name.
On the most westerly tip of Cumbria, the village of St Bees is home to a 900-year-old priory and a school whose pupils are well acquainted with their local saint.
Welcome to St Bees! St Bees is named after St Bega.
And this is her legendary story.
Out there is the Irish Sea. Bega was a young Irish princess, betrothed to a Viking prince.
Her father wanted the marriage to take place, but Bega definitely didn't. She was a Christian and she didn't want to marry a heathen.
So she decided to run away from home. Even though she was locked in her room, an angel visited her. And the angel gave her a bracelet which was able to open locked doors. This allowed her to escape in a small boat to England.
When she had arrived here in Cumbria, she lived as a hermit, but she wanted to live out her Christian faith by starting a church.
But she needed somewhere to build a church. It was the middle of summertime, and she went to the local landowner called Lord Egremont.
He said whatever land was covered in snow the next day, she could have.
The next morning was Midsummer's Day, but the whole land was covered in snow.
And so it meant that all this land became hers, and she built the church, which has now become St Bees Priory.
This is all legend, but some say it's true.
What we do know is that this village was originally called Kirkby Beacock, which means a church by the settlement of Bega.
The priory has been here since 1120 AD.
Even today, it remains a key part of our village community and of the school.
Every week we join here all together for a whole school service. It is an amazing building with a lot of signs of Bega.
In almost every part of the UK, there's a place named after a saint. And joining me in St Albans is Reverend Richard Coles, who's a bit of an expert on these saintly places.
Well, in the Middle Ages and before that, it was very important for a place to have a sort of local hero, if you see what I mean. Partly because it put them on the map, but partly also because there seems to be a sort of impulse in people, in religious people, to identify with other people. You know, religion can sometimes get a bit abstract, and I think lots of times people like to see a religion as it plays out in the life of an individual, so they can sort of focus on that and relate to that. And then around that, sort of stories build up, communities build up, and before you know it, you've got an identity for a whole community.
So who are all these little-known saints?
Well, there's loads of them. I mean, there's a lovely saint called St Romwald of Buckingham, not very far from here, and he was born and came out of his mother's womb saying, "I am a Christian, I am a Christian, I am a Christian." He then preached a sermon on the brevity of life and died aged 3 days. Now, to you or I, that means like rather a surprising activity for a newborn to do. But it's a legend that was important to people then because it gave them some sort of identity. And also, it's like a kernel of truth in them that preserves an essential truth, which is what's it like to dedicate your life to God, to live your life in accord with the will of God and the grace of God and the light of God. And that's really what saints are about. People who anticipate heaven through living a godly life in the here and now.
I mean, it's just really interesting the way that saints were perceived then to how we perceive them now.
Oh, yes. Now I think saintly behaviour would be harder to identify. A lot of the saints of the past would be diagnosed with mental health problems now. Voice hearing, the sort of austerities that they would practice, going without food, going without rest. And I think our eyes are not as open as they were to the strangeness and the miraculousness and the mysteriousness of how God works out in people's lives. You're encountering this all the time in the most unlikely places. Street homeless people, young people, the very old, people on the margins of things who are pretty much overlooked or ignored and yet live lives of extraordinary holiness if you've got the time and the patience to actually sit and listen and see.
Are we all saints?
I think we all can be saints. God wants us to bear the authentic likeness of his Son, to restore the goodness and the grace and the light and truth of Jesus Christ in us. We are his hands, his feet, his mind, his words, his deeds. And if we give ourselves to God, God will use us, frail, broken vessels that we are, for God's purposes. And some people are really good at that. And those are the people whom I think we would acknowledge as saints and see in them what it might be like to live entirely to God. A life of blessedness and holiness. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing when you encounter it.